Hi, and welcome to the Gary Wilkerson Podcast. So glad you're with us here today. We have a very special topic here today and a very special guest. We're going to be talking about world missions, about the cause and the kingdom of Christ, particularly in the context of missions in development, where it changes a whole life, it changes a whole family, changes a whole community, and to some extent even changes a whole nation by digging into the full gospel, the full kingdom of God. But before we talk to our guest, Andreas Stephenson, we're going to be just taking 2 or 3 minutes to share a little bit of the history of our World Challenge Missions Ministry. If you know about World Challenge at all, you'll know that it was started by my father, David Wilkerson. Maybe you've read The Cross and Switchblade and work that he did in New York City with gang members. And then it began to move into work among drug addicts. That was where Teen Challenge began. And then he started traveling around the world doing conferences, speaking to youth. It was at a time of crisis in America, and hundreds, and if not thousands and thousands of young people were coming to Christ in his meetings. And so he started this ministry called World Challenge, which encompasses to some degrees the drug program still, our partnership with Teen Challenge. But it goes beyond that into teaching and preaching and podcasts like this, as well as missions ministry. When people are so kind to and generous to give money to the ministry out of our messaging, we use large portions of that for missions. Originally, it was more of a foundation, I guess, if you will, a grant writing. We'd find a good cause, a feeding program, an orphanage, and help sponsor that. And then we starting our own ministries, started our own orphanages, our own feeding programs. After many years of seeing those feeding programs and those orphanages, we started wondering if there's a better way to get to the root problems of a culture, of a community. What were the problems that were causing a particular locale to need an orphanage with 200-300 children in it? What would cause a perpetual need for a feeding program generation after generation? What if we were able to find a way that the Holy Spirit could give us to help solve the problems of that community? And that's what our guest today is involved with World Challenge Missions, and Andreas Stephenson is overseeing this development program. It's a partnership with another ministry called CHE. We'll talk a little bit about that as well, community health and education, or community health and evangelism. But first of all, just welcome you, Andreas. Glad you're here with us today. You've been with World Challenge Ministry now for how many years?
It's about 9 years now.
About 9 years. Originally, you were partnering with us as we partner with Times Square Church in New York City.
Yes, I actually came to the U.S. to work at Times Square Church 20-some years ago and met my wife there and never left. And
cool. Yeah.
then, long story short, ended up at World Challenge.
Yeah. And you're originally from?
Denmark.
Okay.
Yep.
And from Denmark, how old were you when you came to the U.S.?
I was 21. I left Denmark when I was 18 when I was a missionary, and worked in Latin America and the Caribbean a few years. And actually, as an 18-year-old, I read The Cross and the Switchblade. And that is what connected me to World Challenge initially, reading that book, because I knew about the power and the work of the Holy Spirit, but, I'd seen some things that was a little odd and a little off previously. And but when I read The Cross and Switchblade, I saw, these are lives that are really being transformed by the Holy Spirit. And I really saw, the parallel to how God works in the New Testament especially. Yeah. And so that was, that really drew me to World Challenge.
Yeah. Well, just your personal devotion to missions is noteworthy. Am I accurate here? When you first came here, you were working in missions ministry with Times Square Church, but you couldn't, because you didn't have the right paperwork, you couldn't take a salary. Is that right? And you were living on...
Initially that was the case. So when I came to the U.S. to work at Times Square Church, I was 21, and I'd been offered a job in the missions department at Times Square, and they had filled out all the paperwork that I needed to bring to the embassy to get a worker's visa. Anyway, I get the visa and end up at Times Square Church a few days later, and I get brought into the office of one of the administrators, and she tells me, listen, this is the wrong kind of visa. It's a 10-year tourist visa, but we can't pay you. Well, at that point, I had just saved up enough money for my plane ticket, and I think I had $40 left after I paid my taxi fare into New York. But I had just been reading books of Hudson Taylor and others who were living by faith. Yeah. And at that point, I was sort of stuck. Do I call my parents and ask them to buy me a ticket so I can go back home and start this process over? Or do I stay and trust God? And God really challenged me, stay and trust me. And so, for the next year and a half, I didn't tell anybody that I couldn't get paid. That was sort of one of the things God, really impressed in my heart. Just keep it to yourself and trust me. And of course, there were a few people in the office that knew just because of their administrative roles. But yeah, I end up living for a year and a half with no real income at all. I ate with the homeless when we went out and fed the homeless in the street.
It's like you couldn't wait for that ministry so you could eat.
No, I ate the same food as them. And but it was such a powerful time because I remember in my Bible every time someone gave me a gift, and it happened quite frequently during that season. I would just write down who gave it to me and what the amount was. And actually, after a year and a half, I calculated it all up, and it turned out to be a little bit more than if I had been on salary. Pretty amazing, God's faithfulness.
Yeah, amen. Wow, that is a good story, and then it's and it shows your devotion to the cause of Christ when it comes to world missions, and now that you're working full time here at World Challenge and overseeing the development branch of our missions organization. The good news is you are getting paid now. Is that correct?
Certainly, yes.
Okay, good. I want to make sure we take care of that. We don't need you to live by. Well, we still need you to live by faith, but maybe for other things. The faith of touching lives, the faith of building gospel-centered churches and communities that are having an impact around the world. So, as I was telling a little bit of the story of World Challenge, I was telling you how we were caring for orphans or starting orphanages sometimes, or feeding programs all around the world. Great things, and we still do those. We still love doing them. But we wanted to get to some of the systemic causes of poverty and of why people are continuing to live in ways that are damaging to their, as the Bible talks about, spirit, soul, and body. In I think it's 2 Thessalonians. And so we started looking more at these long-term solutions, which is called development, correct?
Yes.
And so can you take a few minutes to explain the difference between sheer relief or mercy ministry and what you would classify as this development, or some people call it transformation?
Yeah.
What are the two, and what's the difference?
Sure. So there's actually sort of three things we often look at when we're teaching people around the world. There's relief, and then what we call betterment, and then development.
Okay.
And relief is meant to be something that predominantly is short term. A good example is if there is a flood or hurricane in a place. A few years ago there was a big hurricane in the Philippines called Hurricane Hunyan, I think, if I remember right. And so thousands of people lost their homes and the ability to take care of themselves. Everything just flooded and disappeared. And so they had nothing. And so, there's a sort of a short-term temporary solution that needs to be put into place when people are in that place where they can't even feed themselves that day because they've lost everything. And then, of course, in addition to that, you have certain parts of the population in any country who can't care for themselves, children, orphans oftentimes, and you have elderly widows who are unable to care for themselves. They just can't handle the heavy load of work anymore. And so there's always some people that we need to care for like that. But the predominant part of society in all countries are able-bodied people who can work, and so if we come in with and give them sort of perpetual relief, they end up oftentimes in a spot where they become reliant on us. They go from being self-reliant. Maybe they didn't have much, but they had something. And us coming in and replacing the hard work that they were putting in themselves to earn a living with free things actually end up causing harm to them in the long run. There's been both Christian and other studies done to show that. And so that is sort of what relief is. It's needed for certain groups. It's needed for short term. But in the long term, for most people, development is the better option.
Okay. And we at World Challenge Missions, we have the short term relief, or the maybe some long term, or like when it is with the orphans or with particularly with widows. That's kind of a very large, vast, growing segment of the population of people we're working with. But then would that be included in the second thing you said, betterment as well, or is betterment different than the crisis relief? So
betterment is kind of like the in-between spot. Okay. And sometimes that's where we start with a new partner ministry that we meet somewhere overseas. There may be a ministry there that right now people are in some sort of crisis or post-crisis, and we may need to come in with some outside resources to help them get to a point of sort of normalcy.
Yeah.
And so there are times that we come in, but the difference is in relief, it's usually always outsiders that come in and do things for the people in need. Betterment, we changed it a little bit, so now it's them and us working together.
Good.
And then you have development where it's them doing for themselves. And we're sort of more along for the ride to coach them and train them and help open their eyes to see the things that maybe God has put in front of them that it's just always been there and they've not really realized that there's a resource here that God can develop, whether it's inside of them or it's a natural resource in their environment that they haven't really fully explored yet.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that in just a moment, but just go back to the betterment for a moment. So I'm thinking of two different stories that the people in our ministry that work more with the relief.
Yeah.
So here's like a woman in, I think maybe Nicaragua, if I'm not Honduras. I'm getting the country wrong, but I remember the story. She was blind, severe cataract. She was probably in her late 80s. And so, that's sort of, we were able to help get her to the doctor, got her eyes where she could see again, helped her kind of create a new living environment for her because she needs that kind of relief. Betterment might be, if I'm not mistaken, then maybe, let's say we still have the widow ministry going, but it's a 65-year-old and she's in good health, but she's been sitting in a little shack somewhere in Central America, no food, no water, nothing to clean her clothes with. And so we partner with a local ministry church or another missions organization and help train her. Like, here's a small business. Would that be?
Yeah, that would be pretty typical for betterment. I can give you an example of something that's happening right now in Burundi. In Burundi, we have a group of widows that we've been supporting for some time. Elderly women, mostly that don't have a lot of resources in their own, and maybe are up in age where there's limits to the physical work that they can do. And so what we've done there is we've been supporting them. We've been building homes for some of them. But in addition to that, we've also been introducing them to this development work that we do. And that has brought about the realization from them. We don't come in and force any of this on them. We just simply introduce them to some biblical principles and to see if there's an interest from their end to put some of this to use in their own lives. And in this case, they've been very interested. And so now we have trainers that are in Burundi that go out to that community and have begun to train these widows in how to start small micro-enterprises, things like fruit stands and small shops that with a little bit of money you can get off the ground, and maybe it won't fully support them, but it might go half the way or a quarter of the way. And if that brings a certain sense of pride to these widows too, being able to support themselves to a degree still. And so that's sort of some of the betterment that we're involved in right now.
Yeah, I love that. And as we get into talking about the development end of things or the transformation, that you're really seeing this thing of the sense of pride, a good, healthy, biblical kind of pride, a godly pride, if you could call it that, and a sense of faith. It'd be another way of putting it. Like we used to think I needed somebody to come in and save me from the outside with food and water and clothes and money to help me do whatever I need to do. And now they're starting to believe that God could answer their prayers, and that's where the long-term development. Then how is that different than even betterment?
Okay, so let me give you a biblical illustration first, because this is something I often share with people. There's a story in I think it's 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 1 through 7, if I remember right off the top of my head. It's where Elisha is encountered by a widow. Her husband was one of the prophets, and some debt collectors have come to take away her sons, and she's in a desperate situation. And so she comes to Elijah, and he says, "What do you have in your house? To pay off the creditors?" And she says, "I have nothing." But the interesting thing about the story is she kind of recants after a second, except this little bottle of olive oil, and that sort of is what development is in a nutshell. It is helping people who maybe are in a place in life where they think they have nothing, but in fact, God has given them something. It may not be developed. It may not be all that it can be yet, but it's there, and it's helping people to realize that God has given them gifts. He's given them abilities that may not be put to full use yet, or that maybe they haven't even realized that they have that gift yet. We had a pastor some years ago at a training we did in Congo who didn't have money for a bus ticket to come to the training. He went out somewhere close to where he lived and started digging in the ground. It's an area quite rich in gold. And he found enough gold flakes of dust, to sell it and buy a bus ticket. And here you have this, one of the absolute poorest countries in the world, but in natural resources, it's the richest country in Africa. And so God has placed this deposit in the ground that is there for the taking. But many people have not gotten to the point yet where they fully realize what God has given them. And so that is really one of the primary things of Christian development work, is to help redirect people back towards God and say, God has given you things. He's given you abilities. There's things in you that can be developed to become more than they are right now.
Wow, that's powerful. I love that story about the gold. That's I'm going to go into my little diversion here. I might get on my soapbox. It just makes me think of, how faith in a developing country is like, I need this, I need a miracle to get to this place for training so that I could serve other people. Yeah. And then I think of here in America, where you sort of have these weird manifestations of gold dust falling from the thing. And it just, I know that's a tangent, but it just, it irks me, because it's a poor testimony for what real faith, what real miracles of God can do. Anyway, let's get back on track. Yep. So the development then is, it's sustainable, it's long-term, it's helping them help themselves. It's and so, here's a couple things that I've seen that you and your team have been able to do. And this may sound strange at first, but I love telling this. You actually are, to some degree, closing down orphanages. And I know that sounds like, well, why would you want to close down orphanages? Well, because, if something were to happen to me and my wife, I wouldn't want my grandkids to live in an orphanage. I'd rather them be adopted into a beautiful, loving home with maybe a couple siblings. And so development can help move children into, you're developing the community. Yep. And so the community is taking responsibility for itself, for its feeding, for its water, for its education systems, and for its orphanages or for the elderly. And so, my mentality coming from the West, and some good things in my heart, compassion and mercy and wanting to help. So I'll go over to those places, and I kind of want to do it all. I want to build them a clinic, and I want to build them a hospital, and I want to build them a school, and I want to build them a new water system, a water well, or a whole system for surrounding communities. And then I feel good about myself. And I also find that it's extremely easy to raise funds for that. But when you start talking about this, where it might be easy to build a water well, but we want to work with them in their community to train them to find ways to get, and sometimes you find out it's like it rains enough there, you get these little, they call them tippy taps, right? You know that more than I do. Yep. And it collects the water, and so you don't have to spend $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 on a well. So there are some local ways of bringing solutions to some of these problems, but without faith and confidence and hope, and with the Western sometimes interference, and I believe we can aid and we can help and bring the gospel in places where it's not preached. But if we do what you said earlier, sort of almost disempower people and hinder faith from happening, then we're, that's the book that you and your staff promote quite a bit, read and promote, is When Helping Hurts. But anyway, so my question for you then is, dig a little deeper into development. So let's picture a community. Let's go to, you mentioned Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. Yep. Take about 60 seconds and tell us what's happening. How bad is the Congo right now?
So the Congo is really one of the hardest places in the world right now. I've tried for the last 3 years to go back to see our team, and they have had an Ebola outbreak twice. They have COVID. There's the area that we work in, a region called North Kivu. They have 70 different armed groups fighting it out. 7-0. 7-0 according to the UN. And so it's a very, very volatile region that constantly getting attacked from all kinds of sides. Just about a month ago, I got a text from our director in Congo, Noah. And Noah sent me a picture of one of the nearby churches where one of these terrorist groups that are in the area had gone in and macheted 13 people to death in the church during service, including a kid and a pregnant woman. And so, it's not the kind of image that anyone wants to look at because it sort of scars you for life. But that's their reality. That's what they're dealing with. And so, of course, in a place like Congo, if I can just expand a little bit more on it, we went in there, and there was a group of pastors that had invited us to come. And, they're living in absolute despair and poverty in this country. And we began to training them a little bit. The starting point of the training, there's many elements to it, but one of the elements is dealing with fatalism. What is fatalism? It's this mindset, this sort of philosophy that are built into many cultures that you can't change anything. In Islam, they call it, say, inshallah. And it's this concept, if God wills, you can't change anything. You're stuck in wherever in life that you were placed, and your best bet is to stick it out and not try to change anything because you can upset the spirit world. Well, even in many countries that where predominantly are Christian nowadays, it's not that many years back when they were definitely not Christians. And so that worldview has not necessarily completely been transformed into their faiths yet. And so you run into places like Congo where that still is very much prevalent. And so we have a responsibility to really bring them to the cross and help them to realize from the Bible that God has given you ability to change things about yourself. You don't have to be afraid. If we're teaching you about growing some kind of new type of crop that you didn't grow before, you don't have to be afraid of doing that, because that is often what creeps up, this fear of doing something new, because what's going to happen in the spirit realm if I do that? My parents didn't do that, and they seem to have made it 50 or 60 years in life. And so me trying to upset the apple cart, so to speak, could be dangerous. Let me stick and do the same thing my parents did. And so that's sort of the worldview that's really endemic in many parts of the world, around the world. And that's something we talk about early on in the training and teaching we do. Now in Congo, one of the pastors that came to the trainings we did, his name is Pastor Kalima. He lives in a town called Canteen. It's surrounded by some of these armed forces. So I've driven out there before, and there's military checkpoints along the way, and you have to kind of watch out where you go there, because there's always things happening. But anyway, he received some of this training, and he went back to his church and said, what could we do together as a community to change sort of our fortune? Got the whole community together. They started talking, and they realized we don't have a school. We would really like to open a school. And, one of the things that we do is we don't come in with a bunch of money and says, well, great, we'll buy your school and build it all for you. Just here's the key. We try to, because, think of it, long term, that's not sustainable. At some point, we're going to leave. And now they have gotten used to, well, it's the outsiders that have got provision for us. Yeah,
pay for the teacher salaries.
Exactly.
We need a chemistry lab, pay for that.
Exactly.
And so they're not thinking in their own faith issues again. They're not thinking, pray this in. Let's get all the farmers that were helping them with the production of their crops, and they're seeing a 50% increase. Why don't we ask them to help build, part of this? So it's
right.
A whole new way of doing things. Yeah, but anyway, go back to what you're saying.
So we want these brothers and sisters to see that God is the solution to the struggles that they have. We may come alongside them for a few years, training and walking with them, but at some point, of course, we're going to leave and start work with a different community somewhere in greater need. And so the point is to train them up to a point where they realize that they're going to come to God for these issues, and we may be God's answer at times. But at some point we're going to be gone, and their reliance has to be on God to fix the issues that they have. And so, case in point, in that community in Congo, they ended up getting the community together, and although it's extremely poor, I've never seen an electrical line in that town, and only one car ever. So it's a really kind of really poor place. But yeah, in that community. everybody agreed to bring what they had to build the school. So someone brought a couple of, these sort of metal roof tiles that they use. Others agreed to go out in the forest and cut down some trees and make some planks. And anyway, they built a school. Today, that school has about 600 students in it.
Oh, my goodness.
Maybe 5 years after they started. And in addition to that, now they have built a secondary school. And the primary school was ranked in the top 5% in the country.
Awesome.
So it's wonderful to see. And all this, the teacher fees are being paid by all the parents, giving something that's about $1 a month equivalent to pay the fees.
What did you bring to the table that helped empower them to do that themselves?
Well, we really, the most important thing I think we brought to the table was for them to realize that they can do this on their own.
That's through teaching, through training, through seminar type formats?
Yes, exactly. We will bring groups, usually maybe 20 or 30 pastors and community leaders together, and we'll take through these lessons where we look at how does the Bible tell us to live, and what are the things that God has put in place. The fact that we can come to God in prayer and trust that He's going to act on our behalf when we cry out to Him. Those are the kinds of things that we want to pour into people, and usually that brings faith into the hearts of people, and they go home and they experiment. That was what Pastor Kalima did. He experimented. It was sort of the first thing he had done. The
first thing he did was a school?
Well, the first thing he did was the school,
Okay, wow.
But then from that point on, it grew to something much more. And I'll be very brief here on it. But after the school, they said, we want to take care of the elderly in our community. And they needed a field. They couldn't afford it. So they prayed. And a little bit wealthier man in the community said he had a large field that wasn't being used, and he agreed to lease it to them for 1 chicken a year. And even in Congo, you can't lease a field for a chicken a year. But they got that field, and now they're growing crops on it that are taking care of elderly in the community.
Yeah, with inflation, it's going up to almost 2 chickens.
Yes.
Yeah,
true. Now Pastor Kalima is at a point where he's really believing in God to do some very big things in and through his church. And so next he started raising up the elders in his church and training them as pastors. And last I heard, they've sent out 14 husband and wife couples to start new churches in surrounding communities. And so, it has grown from impacting people in one community now. It has multiplied to other communities. And the only reason, this is why it's so important in development not to infuse too much money from the outside. If we do that, people around the world who don't have access to money like we do realize, we can't copy this. And so what's the point of even trying?
It's not reproducible.
Exactly, because they can't just dump $50,000 or something that we might be able to do. But when it's their solutions and their ideas that are being put to use and not ours, they do it in a manner with which they can afford to. And so, that church has grown to, 14 churches now, maybe more at this point. And that's because it's replicatable and done by them and not us.
I love that. I'm glad you brought up that particular setting because it really shows it's kind of like a model. You're doing this all around the world in some of the most extremely poor, impoverished places that seem hopeless, and you're seeing hope rise. Yeah. And one of the questions I think we get a lot. I know when we were first doing this, even presenting it to our own board, there were some questions, and I think they're valuable questions. And but there's a suspicion in the Western church towards things that have this. It's almost like, is this just welfare? Is it just social? Yeah. Is it the social gospel? Is it just helping? Like you'll hear things like. Not from our board, but from others, you'd hear things like, well, now these kids can go to school and they can have, a little bit more clean water in their house, but they're still going to hell. So what I hear you saying, this is a lot of churches are involved. The gospel is being preached. Churches are being planted. People are getting saved. Yeah. I know in Uganda, early on when we first started doing this, the churches there had sort of that mentality of within these 4 walls, we're the chosen frozen, we're the holy remnant, and they had very little contact with the outside world. Yeah. And when they started going into the community and training them, something as simple as wash your hands after you use the bathroom, cut the mortality rate down, it cut the waterborne diseases down, and so the community became more healthy. They started training them in how to get better crop production, and so the farmers now were like, "Wow, the church helped me do this." And so those people started getting curious. They started coming to the church, and I remember hearing years ago that somewhere between, don't quote me on the statistics, but like the least church growth was like 40%. And some of the churches had grown like 400%, from 50 people to hundreds and hundreds of people, all brand new saved, all on fire for God, and all now reaching out to their surrounding neighbors with the gospel,
Yes.
but the gospel with that love of Jesus that says, well, we also care your children have malaria, and we want to help there too. And you can't send your kids. There's no school within your region. And so it's the compassion of Jesus, the love of Jesus, but through a very hands-on mentality. And so, I mean, I think you're bringing it straight home to us that this is biblical. This is Jesus-centered. This is gospel-centered. It's Christ-centered, right?
Yes, I certainly believe so. God is concerned about every part of our lives.
Yeah.
I think in the West, we've actually gotten a little bit wrong. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. I think that really saw a separation between the spiritual and the physical. The spiritual was a higher realm, and the physical was a lower realm. Well, God placed us on the earth, and He told us to care for this planet. Yeah. And so he has put us in a place where we're stewards of what we have here. And our stewardship, as with our tithing and other things, it's not only of our money, but it's also of our health. It's of many different aspects of life. And so, I think we have a responsibility to go in and look at the whole person, not just sort of nitpick the little parts that fit us, but look at the whole person, because God has put solutions both in Scripture and just the wisdom that He has imparted to us in many different aspects of life. This morning, I was sharing at our morning staff devotions and talking about breaking up the fallow ground. Well, that's a biblical principle from Exodus. This idea of, well, the ground is fallow, and you have to break the ground every so often. And what you also do is you need to let it sit every 7 years. Mm-hmm. Well, that's godly wisdom that's being put into practical use in life. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that the Israelites at the time understood the scientific reason for it all. That took a lot longer probably, but they did understand that when they followed these rules and laws that God had put in place, it is ensured that the land was able to produce for many generations to come.
And it's doing it. You're doing this all around the world. You're doing it, as I said just a minute ago, in the roughest places, Congo, places like South Sudan, the Middle East, Latin America, Cuba. Yep. And we've talked a little bit about some of these nations. I want you to come back at our next episode. Join me again. We're going to take a break here right now, but and I want to talk about some of these nations and some of these communities you're working in. But also, we love where God works in people's lives, the miracle. In our ministry started with the miracle of a guy named Nicky Cruz, a gang member. Yeah. But that hasn't ended. It wasn't like we have one story back in 19 whatever. Yep. We are seeing them, yesterday, the day before yesterday, this week, miracle after miracle of lives being transformed. So I want you to share some of those stories. So you okay to come back again in the next episode?
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Andreas. Andreas, head of a development program here at World Challenge. Good job, man. I thank the Lord for the work you're doing.
Well, thank you for having me, Gary.
Yeah.
The Gary Wilkerson Podcast is brought to you by World Challenge, transforming lives through the message and mission of Jesus Christ. Each week, this podcast reaches thousands of listeners. This critical work is made possible by the generous contributions of individuals like you who believe in World Challenge's mission. Thank you for listening and supporting.